It didn't start with a kiss or a promise. It started with a cup of tea, a quiet smile, and a feeling I hadn't known in years. Peace. I moved into the house on Willow Street on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that feels caught between seasons. The air still heavy with summer warmth, but the breeze already carrying the promise of autumn. I didn't come here looking for anything except quiet. After years of drifting from city to city, chasing jobs that never filled the silence inside me, I thought maybe stillness would finally do what motion couldn't. Help me breathe again. The house wasn't new. The walls creaked, the floors spoke when you walked, and the paint had faded into soft tones of history. But there was something comforting about it, as if it had learned to live with its imperfections and still stand tall. And then there was her, Clara, the owner. She opened the door with the calm poise of someone who had seen enough of life to not be startled by much anymore. Mid-40s, maybe, shoulder-length dark hair with silver threads catching the light. A kind of natural beauty that didn't ask to be noticed, but somehow always was. Her voice was low and steady, the kind that seemed to slow the world down when she spoke. "You must be the new tenant," she said with a faint smile. "I'm Clara. Come in before the rain decides to make this harder." I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the scent. Lemon polish, faint traces of lavender, and something warm baking in the kitchen. It smelled like home, something I hadn't felt in a long time. She showed me around. The narrow staircase, the reading nook by the window, the small balcony overlooking the sea. Every corner carried her touch, soft curtains, neatly stacked books, a vase of half-wilted daisies that somehow looked perfect where they were. When we reached the kitchen, she turned to me and said, "You look like you could use a cup of tea." It wasn't a question. I nodded, maybe too quickly. She moved gracefully, like someone used to solitude but not bitterness. As she poured the tea, the rain began tapping against the window, light at first, then steady. The sound filled the pauses between our words. She asked where I'd come from. I told her everywhere and nowhere, and she smiled like she understood what that meant. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed, just barely. But it was enough to make something shift. A small spark, too subtle to name, but impossible to ignore. We sat at the table, listening to the rain. There wasn't much conversation, yet the silence didn't feel empty. Felt peaceful. Like maybe two people who had carried their own storms for too long had found, by some quiet accident, a roof that could hold both. That night, lying in my new room, I could still hear the rain. But what echoed louder was her voice. Calm, kind, and unguarded. I didn't know then how much that voice would come to mean to me. All I knew was that, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. It's strange how quickly the unfamiliar becomes routine. By the second week, the house on Willow Street no longer felt like someone else's home. It felt like a space that had started learning me. The floorboards didn't creak in surprise when I walked by anymore. The kettle's whistle had become my morning cue. And somewhere in that soft rhythm of ordinary days, there was her, Clara. She had a way of moving through the house that felt almost musical, not in sound, but in presence. You could tell where she'd been by the faint traces she left behind. The lingering scent of jasmine lotion, a half-folded sweater on the armchair, a single classical record humming in the background. She was always doing something. Pruning her garden, rearranging books, writing small lists in her notebook that I was never curious enough to ask about, but always noticed. We started crossing paths more often. At first, by coincidence. Later, maybe not so much. If she was out tending to her plants, I'd somehow find a reason to walk downstairs. If I brewed coffee, there always seemed to be an extra cup. We spoke in fragments about the weather, the ocean, the way seagulls screamed like they owned the place. She told me about her late husband once, in passing. Said he used to fix radios and never finished his projects. Her eyes softened when she said it, the way light dims before dusk. After that, I started noticing the unfinished things. The half-painted stool in the corner, the stack of broken watches on the shelf. She hadn't removed him from the house. She'd simply learned to live with what was left behind. One evening, I found her sitting on the porch, reading a book under the fading orange sky. I asked if she minded company. She didn't. I sat beside her, and we watched the world settle into its evening quiet. She handed me her cup, chamomile tea this time, and I took a sip before realizing she hadn't offered it as much as shared it. Moments like that didn't feel romantic. Not yet. They felt familiar, like remembering something I hadn't known I'd lost. Sometimes, I'd catch her humming while cooking, an old tune, something from another decade. She never sang the words, just the melody, soft and low. I started recognizing it by heart, even when she wasn't there. There was comfort in the smallness of those days, the smell of wet earth after her watering the plants, the sound of her slippers brushing against the wooden floor, the occasional laugh that escaped when I made a bad joke over breakfast. I didn't realize it then, but those ordinary sounds had started to fill a space inside me that had been echoing for years. And maybe, though she never said it, I think they filled something in her too. It happened on one of those nights when everything outside feels still, when the world seems to hold its breath. The power went out just after sunset. One moment, the house was glowing with lamplight and soft music. The next, darkness folded in, thick and quiet. From upstairs, I heard her voice, calm, slightly amused. "Looks like Willow Street's gone dark again." I found her in the kitchen, a small candle flickering in her hand. The flame caught the gold in her eyes, softened every line of her face. She handed me another candle and smiled faintly. "You take that side. I'll handle this one." We lit the house together, one small light at a time. The rain had returned, tapping lightly against the windows, and the air smelled of wet earth and melted wax. By the time we were done, the living room glowed with a gentle amber hue. She gestured for me to sit. "Might as well wait it out," she said, curling into her chair. I sat across from her, close enough that the candlelight touched both our faces. There was a calm between us, not the awkward kind, but the kind that feels safe. We talked at first about nothing, the weather, the power company, the stubborn leak in the roof she kept meaning to fix. But the longer we talked, the deeper the silences between our words began to feel. They weren't empty pauses. They were full of things neither of us knew how to name yet. At some point, she asked, "Why did you really move here?" I hesitated. "I guess I got tired of being temporary everywhere I went." She looked down, tracing the rim of her mug. "I know that feeling," she said softly. "After my husband passed, I thought maybe if I kept the house the same, nothing else would change. But life doesn't really ask what we're ready for, does it?" The room felt smaller then, not because it was dark, but because we were closer. Her voice trembled just enough to make me want to reach out. But I didn't. I just listened. "I don't really let people in anymore," she admitted, her eyes glancing toward me, cautious but honest. "It's easier that way." I wanted to tell her I understood, that maybe I hadn't let anyone in either, but the words felt too heavy. So instead, I said quietly, "Sometimes easier isn't the same as better." She didn't answer, just looked at me. A long, searching look that felt like a question and an answer at once. The candle flickered between us. I could hear the rain softening outside, the faint sound of her breathing, steady, measured, real. We didn't touch that night. We didn't have to. Somehow, in the warmth of that small room, under the hum of quiet rain and trembling candlelight, something unspoken began to form. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. And when I went upstairs later, I realized I was no longer thinking about how temporary this place was. For the first time, I was wondering how it might feel to stay. The days after that night felt different. Not louder or brighter, just different. There was a new kind of awareness between us, like a soft current beneath the surface. But if I felt it, so did she. And instead of leaning into it, Clara began to retreat. It started subtly. A closed door that had once been left open. Fewer cups of tea waiting on the table. Conversations that ended before they could really begin. When I'd come downstairs in the mornings, she was already gone. Out tending the garden or walking into town or simply busy. Her voice, once steady and open, became careful again. Every word seemed chosen. Every smile looked a little too practiced. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But the quiet between us had changed shape. It wasn't the calm we'd shared before. It was distance. One evening, I caught her by the gate, hands deep in soil, replanting something that didn't need replanting. She looked up when she heard me, startled, like she hadn't expected me to still be there. "You don't have to help," she said quickly. "I wasn't going to," I replied with a half-smile. It made her laugh, just a little, but then her eyes fell again, her focus shifting back to the earth. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment. "Maybe I've kept this house too full. Too many memories. Too many people passing through." I didn't know what to say. The way she said it, people passing through, it sounded like she was already preparing for me to become one of them. A neighbor stopped me the next day, an older man who ran the local bookstore. "You're renting from Clara?" he asked. "She's good people. Keeps to herself. Doesn't let anyone stay too long, though. Says peace doesn't survive too many footsteps." His words sat heavy with me the rest of the day. Back at the house, I found her on the porch, staring out at the sea. The wind was strong, carrying the scent of salt and rain. Her hair blew loose around her face, and for a moment, she looked both grounded and far away. "You're quiet these days," I said gently. She didn't look at me. "Some silences are safer." The way she said it made something in my chest ache, because I knew what she meant. When you've lost too much, even peace feels dangerous. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the windows. I thought about leaving, about sparing her whatever this was becoming. But part of me knew walking away wouldn't be peace either. Maybe distance wasn't her way of rejecting me. Maybe it was her way of trying to protect herself. From hope, from loss, from whatever had started quietly growing between us. And maybe I wasn't ready to let her hide behind it anymore. The storm came without warning. One minute, the air was heavy and still. The next, the wind howled through Willow Street like something wild had been set free. From my window, I saw the sky turn the color of slate. The first drops of rain hit hard and fast, blurring everything beyond the garden. I was about to close the shutters when I saw her. Clara, outside, struggling with a tarp, trying to cover her flower beds as if she could hold the storm back with her bare hands. I didn't think. I just ran. By the time I reached her, the rain had already soaked through both of us. The wind whipped her hair across her face as she tried to tie the corner of the tarp down. "Go back inside," she shouted over the roar. "Not a chance," I yelled back, grabbing the other end. For a moment, it was chaos. Mud splashing, hands slipping, the sky cracking open above us. And then, somehow, we got it secured. She turned toward me, breathless, rain streaming down her cheeks, her eyes bright with something between exhaustion and defiance. "Why do you always have to help?" she asked, her voice breaking under the noise of the storm. "Because you never let anyone else try," I said. That stopped her. The rain pounded against the porch roof, the world spinning in gray and thunder, and still we stood there, two drenched silhouettes, too close and too full of everything unsaid. "You think I need saving?" she asked, her voice trembling now, not from cold, but from something deeper. "No," I said softly. "I think you're afraid of needing anyone." Her breath hitched. The storm raged around us, but for that one suspended moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just her. The curve of her jaw, the flicker of pain in her eyes, the way she tried so hard to hold herself together. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't lose someone again." "You won't," I said. "Not everyone leaves." The words hung there, fragile and trembling. And then, finally, she stopped fighting. Her hands, cold and shaking, reached for mine. Not to hold, but to steady herself. Her forehead came to rest against my chest, and I could feel the uneven rhythm of her breathing through the fabric between us. We stood that way as the rain poured down. No promises, no declarations. Just the quiet truth of two people who had both been tired of pretending they were fine. When the thunder softened into a distant hum, she finally looked up. Her eyes glistened, not from the rain. "You should come inside," she said, voice low, almost tender. But we both knew. Neither of us would ever be quite the same after that night. The storm had passed, but something else had been undone, and in its place, something fragile and real had finally begun to grow. The morning after the storm felt like the world had exhaled. When I woke, the air was cool and sweet, that scent only rain can leave behind, like the earth itself had been washed clean. The house was still, except for the faint hum of the kettle downstairs. I followed the sound. Clara was there, standing by the window in her robe, hair loosely tied, light pooling around her like the morning had chosen her first. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. "Morning," I managed. She smiled, small, tired, real. "You sleep at all?" "Not much," I admitted. "Me neither," she said, turning back to the window. Outside, the garden was a mess. Soil scattered, petals clinging to wet leaves, branches bent under the weight of the storm. Yet somehow it still looked beautiful, like survival itself could be a kind of grace. She poured 2 cups of coffee and handed me one. Our fingers brushed. Again, that quiet electricity, softer now, almost familiar. I noticed her hand trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away this time. "I'm sorry about last night," she said finally. "Don't be," I told her. "Storms bring things down, but maybe that's not always bad." She let out a breath, half a laugh. "You make things sound simpler than they are." "Maybe I just want them to be," I said. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and I saw something there. Not certainty, but surrender. Not the kind that gives up, but the kind that finally stops fighting. We sat by the window for a long while, not talking, just watching the world rebuild itself. A beam of light slipped through the clouds and touched her face, and in that moment, I thought, this is what peace looks like. Not perfection, not control. Just 2 people sitting quietly after everything has come undone, and realizing neither one ran. After a while, she leaned her head on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, barely a movement, but it felt like a lifetime of walls quietly falling. "You make it easy to breathe again," she said softly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the ease of something that had been waiting to happen. Outside, the sky was clearing, the kind of blue that looks new. Seagulls called in the distance. The garden glittered with rainlight. Everything smelled alive again. For the first time since I'd moved into that old house, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt present, grounded, home. And maybe she felt it too, because when she finally looked at me, really looked, her expression wasn't guarded anymore. It was open, quietly hopeful, as if somewhere between the thunder and the silence, we had both found what we didn't even know we were searching for. Weeks passed, but the morning after the storm never really ended. It just stretched gently into the days that followed. The house on Willow Street began to feel different again. Not in the way it did when I first moved in, when I was just trying to get used to the creaks and the quiet, but in a deeper, quieter way. Felt alive. Felt shared. Clara had started leaving the kitchen window open again, letting the ocean breeze drift in. The vases she'd once filled with half-wilted flowers were now full of color. Daisies, lilacs, whatever she picked from the market that morning. She laughed more easily, too. The kind of laughter that came from somewhere real. Some days we still moved through the house like before, each in our own rhythm, giving the other space. But the silence wasn't distance anymore. It was comfort, a language we'd learned together. She'd make coffee, and I'd fix the little things around the house. The loose hinge on the door, the leaky faucet she'd been meaning to call someone about for years. She'd tease me for making her kitchen smell like paint or sawdust. I'd tell her it was part of the charm. Sometimes, when the evenings turned cool, we'd sit on the porch together, her hand resting on my arm, the sound of the sea blending with our quiet breathing. Nothing needed to be said because some bonds don't grow from words. They grow from being there. One night, she asked me, "You still thinking of leaving when your lease ends?" I looked at her, and the question felt heavier than it sounded. I said truthfully. But it doesn't feel right anymore. She smiled then, that soft, knowing kind of smile. "You've started leaving your books on the living room shelf," she said. "That's usually how it begins." We both laughed. But beneath the laughter was something real, the quiet recognition that I wasn't just passing through anymore. I stayed. The spare room became our room. The mornings became a kind of ritual, shared coffee, shared silence, shared glances that said what words never could. The garden bloomed again, stronger than before, as if it too had learned that storms don't always destroy. Sometimes they just make you start over. One evening, I came home from town to find her sitting by the window, her face calm in the golden light. She looked up and said, "You're back." And I smiled, because that simple phrase carried more meaning than any declaration ever could. Later, as I locked up and the house settled into its familiar quiet, I realized something I'd never understood before. Love wasn't fireworks or promises or rescue. It was this, the steady sound of her laughter down the hall, the warmth of her hand finding mine in the dark, the peace that came when I finally stopped running. As I held her close that night, I found myself whispering words I hadn't planned to say, but knew were true. I didn't know love could feel like coming home, until you. And in her soft smile, I knew. She felt it too.